of the community. So I want to give you a brief overview now of the data I've collected to begin to look at this process of enregistrement. The data for looking at stance taking comes from two sources. First is a thread in 2006 where a fellow MetaFilter member, and who also happens to be a linguist, wanted to poll the community and directly asked the community members for their pronunciation of the MSET. Later in 2010, I did a poll of the community and posted a meta talk as a discussion thread after taking the poll. So after they took the poll, they were encouraged to come discuss the pronunciation in the poll and thoughts about the MSET. So here's some metadata about these two threads. The first was posted in 2006. It had 102 comments by 63 MetaFilter members. The second one was in 2010, 472 comments by 187 MetaFilter members. I coded all of the comments on several criteria. For this presentation, just three will be primarily looked at. So whether or not the pronunciation, or whether or not the comment stated a pronunciation preference for the MSET, whether or not the comment contained a cultural reference that pointed to a person, place, product, some pop culture thing, or something out there in the world. And then lastly, whether or not there was a stance of correctness. So if somebody said that one pronunciation was right or wrong or good or bad, or it should be said this way, or it's proper if it's done like so. Here is an overview of the comments from both threads. So you see the 2006 thread in blue and the 2010 thread in red. And the first thing we notice in these first four columns, looking at the stated pronunciation of the MSET, is that the abbreviated name for MetaFilter is given, preferences are given for that much more than the name by which MetaFilter members use to refer to themselves. I do believe that the abbreviated name is the much more salient variable, as people tend to discuss that first and more often, as evidenced by these two threads as well. You also see in the 2006 thread that there are more stated pronunciation preferences overall. I believe this is because it was directly asked. So these, I just want to say before I go on that these two threads aren't directly comparable, but they do give us an overview of what the comment distribution looks like based on these three coding criteria, and can prompt further study where to look at things more. So we see, moving on, looking at indexing person, place, or product, it's interesting to note that over half of the comments in both threads reference something out there in the world, whether it's a person, a place, or a product, or some pop culture reference. And that tells you that a lot of different things are being drawn upon, a lot of different things are being indexed. What things, why, what's most salient or most tuned to. We can look at this through favoriting behavior as well. And then lastly, looking at taking a correctness stance. It's interesting to note that there is more correctness stances taken in the 2010 thread than in the 2006 one. And I personally feel that the percentages are rather high for both of those in general. I didn't really realize until I started coding the data that there was at least 15%, 15 and 21% for both of these threads of people taking correctness stances. Before we actually look at qualitative examples of comment data, I want to go through a few things about challenges in quantifying stance data. So stance data is messy and it's difficult to code. Each stance varies, and that's dependent on many different things, such as the context or who's participating in the thread, as well as other factors. There's no typology of stance that currently exists. It's up to the researcher to determine which categories are important and then to explore those further. A qualitative look at stance. Looking at stated pronunciation preferences in comment data, I looked at these in two different ways. So the first was whether or not the comment explicitly stated their stance. MeFi is what I say. Versus a non-explicit, and this means that the comment needs to be unpacked somewhat, or usually relies on wordplay or maybe puns, that sort of thing. So this example here, so easy, just do it like this, me fi fo fum, me fight ho hum. Looking at stances with cultural reference, so this is person, place, products. looked at these in two different ways as well. A transparent reference would be something like the comment here. It's spelled MEFI, but it's pronounced throat warbler mangrove, where then it's explicitly stated that this reference comes from Monty Python. No unpacking required. And the oblique version, I'd have called it a Chazwazzer, where you have to know that there is some in-group knowledge being indexed here. You'd have to know that this was a comment from The Simpsons because the comment doesn't directly state that this comes from The Simpsons. And presumably the author of the comment recognizes that there's going to at least be some portion of the metafilter population that will get that cultural reference. It also says something about what that person and what metafilter might take interest in, or believes that metafilter might take interest in. Looking at correctness stances, this is where the data starts to get very messy because this can come in a bunch of different forms, not just the three right, wrong, good, bad, correct, incorrect that I've highlighted here. But looking at a right, wrong stance, an example here, no explanation why, but it's right, damn it. A good, bad stance, using meh in any label equals hipster snark equals bad, doom, no good. And then correct, incorrect. I always thought MeFi, then I started going to meetups and was roundly corrected to MeFi. And we can start to see the complexity of stance and indexicality. There is a comment here that I think is a very good reference of all sorts of different types of stances going on. I've always been a MeFi, but I heard someone calling it Mephi, rhyming with that kid from Family Circus, and I think that's funny and charming, but wrong. So we can see how a variety of different stances are enacted, and we'll go through this step by step. Pronunciation stance. I've always been a MeFi. And then we've got a cultural reference as well, rhyming with that kid from Family Circus. And I didn't get into this before, but lots of stances are evaluative. And this is one such example. I think that's funny and charming. And then finishing up with a correctness stance, but wrong. There's also many more types of stances going on, and another one I'd like to highlight is the alignment that's happening by others through favoriting behavior. So 29 people on Metafilter favorited this comment, and when I looked at my poll data, I can see that the 29 people who favorited this comment all took the poll, but not all of them share the same pronunciation preference as MeFi, so they're not all MeFi sayers. So that tells you that at least some of these commenters are aligning to some other stance in this comment as their rationale for why they favorited it. And people favor it for all sorts of different reasons, of course. To summarize stance taking, there are many types of stances, and people use many different linguistic resources in making them. This idea of stance, it mediates the relationship between phonetic variants and social factors. And the process of enregisterment starts with stances. We can track this process by examining the types of stances that are being made, who's making them, who's acknowledging them, and in what ways. This leads me to further research, always. So further research questions. How can we overcome these challenges in coding and analyzing stance data? We looked at some of those challenges before, what categories to choose, how to arrange data, how to interpret data. Especially when data is very messy and it contains, maybe one comment contains several stances in several possibly conflicting directions. So which methods, typologies, and tools are useful? And we can take an interdisciplinary approach here too and see what other communities, academic communities, are using in looking at stance data or evaluative commenting, evaluative speech. When we get back to enregisterment, how do we know when a form is fully enregistered? What are the markers of that? What are the indicators? Also, enregisterment status can change. So how do we know when, let's say, a social meaning that's tied to a certain form no longer holds, or that enregisterment is lost entirely, if it changes or is lost? And presumably, these different variants having different levels of saliency or meaning to different groups of people, or being preferred in different amounts, would affect the rate at which these phonetic variants are getting enregistered. So how do we track and compare these rates as they're happening and changing over time? Starting to sum up here, so the way you say this matters, the way you say the MSET matters. These participants in the community, they're enacting styles, they're doing this publicly, and through this they shape the group identity with stance taking. and also through alignment practices such as favoriting comments and quoting others, and identity practices such as creating profiles and stating what they're about and using the content of their speeches, of course. These stances are social positions involving sociolinguistic variables. It happens that the name of this community happens to be a very highly salient sociolinguistic variable, and names of communities themselves are representative of that community's identity. So we get a bunch of meta layers going on here. To conclude, we can continue to use online resources, online community data, speech data that's in text form, text-based form, and that will help us over time expand our knowledge of and broaden our understanding of language evolution and change, the indexicality of language, how meaning is registered through stance taking, and then, of course, identity creation using these linguistic resources, also using names, wordplay. So I look forward to sharing more data with you on this. Thank you very much for your time. There's my references. And thank you again.